How many of you in our church are of Cuban descent? Can I see your hands? You're of Cuban descent. A lot more today in this service than the earlier ones, which means I guess Cubans sleep in a little later. That cafecito just has to be just perfect. Some of you will recall that in 1995, 1999, Elian Gonzalez was 5 years old. His mother would have tried to bring him to America, jumped on a raft, crossed the Florida State Straits, but then died while on the journey. They were then picked up by Coast Guard, who brought them to her family here in the States. At that point, the Cuban government and Fidel Castro started to appeal to our government and make this a big issue. Because ultimately he, not the father, but Castro, was asking for his son, 5-year-old Elian, to be returned to Cuba. Well, in South Florida, it was an outrage because of so many of our Cuban community and them seeing what this ultimately would mean for the young boy, as well as what it would look like from the Cuban government's perspective. And so they really took this to heart. And they were objecting to young Elian being given back to his blood father, who had divorced his mother but then had been remarried. At the time, I was trying to pursue further studies, so I enrolled in a school in Indiana, and I went out to take the first class of introduction. And when I flew into Indiana, I was picked up by a taxi, and the taxi driver asked me where I was from. And when I mentioned Miami, he immediately went to this subject matter. And he started to share his opinion on it, which from a distance made total sense. How do you keep a boy from his birth father, especially after the boy's birth mother had died? Well, when I began to share what would be my perspective of it, not that I am Cuban, but I was raised in this city pretty much from birth in the Westchester area. All I've known is South Florida. So when I began to share with him the sentiment in the heart of the people that I knew, the Cubans of South Florida, he was appalled. He just could not understand it, which taught me a valuable lesson. And the lesson was this: on certain matters in life, if you do not know the history that is attached to the situation, you could totally get it wrong. History means a lot. So what we want to be able to do in our teaching today is go back, and I'm going to try to pose and then answer a certain number of questions. For instance, who are the Israelis and the Palestinians, and have they always been in conflict? We'll also ask, who is occupying who? We'll ask, how did we get to this point of a war being waged today? And then why is this land so important that both of these groups are willing to die for it? And then ultimately we'll ask, what does the Bible say about this? That's why we prayed, because we have a lot of information we need to get to this morning. And I pray your hearts will be open to receiving it all. So first, let's talk about these two people groups, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and why it is there's been this conflict over land. Well, we read in Genesis chapter 12 that the Lord tells Abraham that he would create a nation through him, and then through that nation, all the people would be blessed. Now, I want to be on the right side of the promise that all the people would be blessed. How about you? So this makes sense to me, because God says, I've got a plan, I've got a purpose, and through this plan and purpose, It's a conduit. And through it, all the people will be blessed. Now, from there in Genesis chapter 12, and what occurs over the next few chapters, which, by the way, is 12 chapters in to the creation of not just a nation, but people. Because Genesis chapter 1 is the creation of people. And then just 12 chapters later, we see the creation of a nation. We move from that to Moses. Moses, who, of course, brought Israel out of Egypt. And by the way, when you look at a map of this region that we'll look at in just a minute, you're going to see down to the bottom Egypt, which would have showed you how far in those days that journey would have been, or how close it would have been. So you move forward to Moses. And then from Moses, we go to Joshua. Moses was promised to go into the promised land, but he couldn't do it. Joshua then led 12 tribes into the land that is called the Promised Land, or Palestine, or Israel today, ultimately the Holy Land. There with Joshua, we're introduced to the 12 tribes, sects, if you will, of Israel. On the heels of that, we meet Saul, who is Israel's first king. He's now the king of this nation. And then from Saul, we're introduced to David. David becomes this king, and what he does that's so unique is he unites all the 12 tribes of Israel into a united monarchy. And then Solomon comes on the scene where the Jews make this promised land their holy land. Now, all of this is found in our Bibles up to this point, which is why, as a Christian, you can't just be a New Testament Christian. You need to embrace the Old Testament as well. You can't just read on what Jesus says and everything over in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so forth. You got to go over to Genesis and you read through, because that is the history from which we ourselves originate. And you need to know your history, because you don't want to repeat the mistakes of history. But from now on, let's look outside of the Bible to the history books that have been written and even taught, so that we know what real history looks like. So now Israel is in this land. But fast forward all the way up until around the 2nd century, where the Romans, after two different revolts of the Jewish people, finally in this third revolt, decide to expel the Jews from the land of Israel. Now, the Jewish people are scattered all around the area, and that area is renamed Palestine. Palestine is the Latin word for Philistines. And if you will recall what the Philistines did with Israel, you'll see there's been a war faction seemingly always taking place. Now, it's called Palestine because of the sea peoples that lived there. And though they are not the Palestinians of today or Palestinians of today, that was the name of the area till 1948, when Israel finally became a nation. Now let's look at something from a map, okay? So let's just get an idea of what Palestine would have looked like in that particular day prior to 1948. So we have it here on the screen for you. And this ultimately would have been Palestine. All the land of Israel, known at that particular point as Palestine. Now, there wasn't necessarily a country at this point. Palestine was not that. This land was not a country. It was never an autonomous nation. After the Jews were expelled, it's pretty much been ruled by the Romans. The Jews were there first, but then the Romans. Then you've got the Byzantine Christians. And then in 640 A.D., it was invaded by the Arabs, who then drove out the Byzantine Christians, which led to the Crusades, with more Arabs taking residence, and then the Ottoman Empire. The Crusades that occur were pretty much all spiritual, religious in nature. And those Crusades lasted. There was about 14, 15 of them. They lasted for about 250 years. All right, just over 200 years of Crusades. Now, How many of you know how old our country is in America? We're 246, going to be next year 247. We're 246 years old as a country. Israel, the land of Israel, at one point of their existence, went through 200 and plus years of just rulership and ownership change. Within those years where the Crusades would have taken place. Imagine that. They're thousands of years old, which is why when you go, you're able to see so many digs and excavations that are taking place, and they're showing you stuff that is thousands of years old. Whereas in America, my gosh, I go to my farm and I walk around and I find arrowheads from the 1940s and 30s and so forth. And prior to that, when the Crete Indians would have been in that area. We're not talking about a couple of hundred years old. We're talking about thousands of years old in this land. And then from that time, in 640 AD forward, the Arabs lived there, who we think of as Palestinians, but the Jews also lived there. Then, towards the end of the 19th century, more and more Jews started to go back to their homeland. And then after the Holocaust, in 1948, the nation of Israel was created. So now you've got the nation of Israel living on the same land where they once lived back during Bible times, all the way until they were driven off by the Romans. And for the few Jews that remained, they did so while living side by side with the Arabs. And even to this place, there's areas in Jerusalem and areas in Israel that when you travel, you see the Arabs and the Christians and the Jews living peacefully by side. So now you've got the nation of Israel living with the Arabs. Now, from the 7th century forward, the Palestinians would say, this is our land. And the Israelis would say, this is our land. Both arguing over the exact same plot of ground that they tell us is about the size of New Jersey. It's one of the tiniest countries on earth. And both sides want that land. In fact, both sides think God has promised them that land, which makes this not just a territorial war, but a religious war, with both believing that the land is rightfully theirs. Which then leads us to this whole question of occupation. Who's occupying who? And it's important for us to be able to answer that question, because as a Christian that lives in America, we know when we look at that region, our hearts are broken because of the death and the destruction that is taking place to all people. We don't understand war. We don't understand what it is to conquer and what is the price to be able to go in and conquer a land. We don't understand that. So from our perspective, we're looking at the innocent civilians on both sides of this, and we're trying to figure out, how do we balance this in our heart, and how should we be praying? Now, one of the charges being made against Israel today is that they are occupiers. And as a result of that, the whole world should rally for the Palestinians, which ultimately, as I share with you, are not really the Palestinians, but Hamas, to help then drive out Israel. So let's look at another map, just so you're aware of what Israel would look like and what the different areas where they are fighting would occur. So as you look at Israel, when we went back in March of this year, though we flew into Tel Aviv off to the left there, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, our journey as pilgrims, because anytime you go to Israel, you're on a pilgrimage. Our journey would have started to the north. And if you look, you'll see a little body of water called the Sea of Galilee. If you look at the Sea of Galilee, then you run south, you see the Jordan River. It's a little darker blue, that squiggly line. That Jordan River then runs all the way down to the Dead Sea. You can't see the dead. All you see is the word dead right under Bethlehem. But that's the Dead Sea. That's as far south as we traveled when we went on our journey together. And many on our journey with us were able to float in the Dead Sea. But if you'll notice now on this map, to the left of the Jordan, which would be the west, is the West Bank. The West Bank, because it's on the west of the Jordan River, is one location that's filled with conflict. But then if you look down to the lower left and you see Gaza at the bottom of Jerusalem on the seaside, you see what is the Gaza Strip. And it's that Gaza Strip where we see this warring taking place. After Israel became a nation in 1948, some of the Arabs fled to the West Bank because it was under the Jordanian control. And others went and settled, we're speaking about the Arabs here, down to Gaza because it was under the Egyptian control. Meanwhile, about 20% of the Arab population stayed in what we call Israel today, sprinkled and scattered all over. But then in 2005, Israel gave up control of the Gaza Strip over to Hamas and have not been occupying, as Jews, have not been occupying Gaza on any level. It is completely run by what would be a political party that is Hamas. Now, the West Bank is shared between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and it's controlled by the party Fatah, F-A-T-A-H, which in 1993 recognized Israel's right to exist. And because of that, that meant peace for Israel with their Palestinian neighbors, and therefore they were willing to give up a certain amount of autonomy of the West Bank. They gave up limited autonomy to the leadership, Fatah, of the West Bank. So they shared in that. And we'll break it down this way for you. We're going to break the map into what they call 3 zones. Because as we went on our journey in Israel, our tour guide would share with us what these different zones look like. So when you start looking at the next map that we have, look over to the left and you'll see the boxes. You've got the Jewish settlement, but then notice Area A, Area B, and Area C. So hopefully I can explain this the right way. Area A, which is that dark pinkish color, if you look over to the right, you'll see it's scattered throughout the map. That is under full Palestinian control. This is all in the West Bank now. Then if you look under that box, you'll see more of a pinkish box. Area P, that's the partial Palestinian control. So now look back to the map of the West Bank, and you'll see those lighter colors, and you'll see those are little areas that are shared with between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Then you look at Area C, which is the green, and you'll see that is under Israeli control. So we explain it this way, that in the West Bank, Area A is completely under Palestinian control with no occupation of Israel at all. Now, if you were to visit Israel today and you would want to go into that region like we had to do, go back to the other map for a minute because I want them to see where we went to visit. For us, it's a very special, holy place called Bethlehem. What happened in Bethlehem? Jesus was born. But if you look at that particular map, you'll see that Bethlehem is under a full Palestinian control. Now, when you go there like we did It's Palestine. They have their own schools. They have their own police forces. They have their own passport controls. They have all of that because they are on their own. And man, the moment you drive across the checkpoint, you can feel it. Our Jewish guide has to get off the bus. They can't even drive on the bus into that region. So we go into that region, and they take you to different stores. And we go into a Palestinian store that is filled with Palestinian Christians, which is another reason why this is so difficult to swallow, to think that there's innocent Palestinian Christians that are in the midst of all of this. But when we went to that store, it was aggressive. Not so much in the store, but getting off our bus to get in, and then getting out of the store back to our bus to go into a restaurant to eat, and then to get out of that restaurant and go back on the bus. It was serious, and we felt it immediately. And we had the men on our bus standing outside because the men were shouting at us, screaming at us, getting mad, throwing things down, pushing things out of the way, just very aggressive, high tension, because it was all about the Palestinians. And though they needed our money, they didn't like that we weren't buying their junk from them off the street. And it became very aggressive. That's the environment in the West Bank. Area B is mutually shared, where Israel provides the security and the Palestinians provide all the other infrastructure. And then Area C are the regions of the West Bank that's under the Israeli control, and the Palestinians primarily don't live in that area. So when some people say that Israel occupies the West Bank, that's not factual, as they gave limited autonomy to the West Bank to Fatah in exchange for Fatah's recognition that Israel has a right to exist. How crazy is that? That you have to share rulership and ownership of a certain territory of your own borders with people that simply say, we're not going to kill you. But in Gaza, where the world is focused right now, the reality is that Israel is not an occupier at all, as no Jews, to our knowledge, live in Gaza. Hamas has complete control, which sadly has been a catastrophe for the people in Gaza. So let's answer the question. Who are the colonizers? Or who are the occupiers? Well, to answer that, we've got to go back, and the question is, how far back do we go? Do we go back to 1948? Do we go back to 640 AD? Do we go back to when the Crusaders for 200 years were in control of the area, or the Byzantine Christians from 324 AD to 640 AD? Or do we go back to the original Canaanites? How far back do we go? Well, to complicate that even more, to say that the Jews stole the land from the Palestinians, now you have to ask yourself, or ask the question, what land are we even talking about? Because how much of that land that we're debating is actually owned or ruled or governed by the Israelis? What we could actually say is that the Israelis and the Palestinians are both occupiers in a sense. But here's the present day tragedy of all of that. Sadly, the Palestinians that we know of as being Palestinians are not the ones that are fighting this battle and leading this. This is not a war between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Israel is at war with Hamas, which is a political party that controls fully Gaza. And their pledge for existence is the destruction, the annihilation of Israel, wanting literally to destroy Israel, which is in its charter as a political party. Someone said to me this morning after this message, "You're right, I just Googled it." Google the Hamas charter and you will see we're here, we exist to erase the existence of the Jewish people. That's why Hamas exists. And it's what we saw on October 7th as an expression of their creed, their very reason for existence. Which now brings us to another question. Let's see how we get to this point of a war even going on where thousands of people are dying. You with me? Hamas is the political party started in 1987 as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that was out of Egypt. And they, along with Fatah, ruled the Palestinians. Now, at one point, they were in opposition to Fatah, but through negotiations and through war and other means, they have taken control of the Gaza Strip. So they're present in Gaza. They're also present in the West Bank, which makes things very tense, as well as Lebanon. They are pledged to the destruction of Israel, and since 2005 alone, they've launched over 30 attacks. They've launched over 30 missile attacks, preemptively attacking Israel because of their pledge to destroy them. They want there to be no nation of Israel. And they want in their creed to actually stake their Palestinian or their Hamas flags in every square foot of soil in Israel. Now, before October 7th, their attacks had primarily been rocket launches. They had a few tunnel crossings. They had a few skirmishes or attacks and with the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers, but most of it has just been through rocket attacks, which one of the greatest defense systems that are on the planet today is the Iron Dome that had been created and invented by Israel for this very reason. Because of these rocket attacks. Israel, if you live there, pretty much as a citizen, you need to have at home for every member of your family a gas mask. Because at any moment you could be gassed. You also have to have a bomb shelter, a bunker, that you and your family could go to when these rocket launches occur. Now, all of this is the reason Hamas wants to attack Israel for this purpose. They want to incite a response from Israel so that then they could characterize to the whole world that Israel is the aggressor. Israel is the perpetrator, so as then to garner more financial support from the Muslim world. Now, when you look at the leadership of Hamas, just do a Google search on the leadership of Hamas, and what you will find is that most of them today don't even live in the Gaza Strip. They don't live in Gaza. They live in Qatar. And many of them are billionaires because of the funding that they have been able to pad their pockets with that have come from other Muslim countries. They're corrupt. 80% of them, funding comes from Iran. And with the funding that comes, not only do they pad their pocket, but they use those financial resources to then buy other rockets that could be launched into Israel. But Hamas knows this. They know they're too small of an army to defeat Israel. So what they'll do is this. They'll initiate an attack so that then Israel will respond. And if they can then do that, maybe they could incite an insurrection in the West Bank. And in doing that, they could get Hezbollah to invade from the north, and then Syria involved. And if they can get Syria involved, maybe they would be able to force Israel into the sea. Because ultimately, Israel has no border except enemies on one side and then the Mediterranean Sea on the other. And that's really what we're seeing right now. As Israel readies itself to respond, but trying to take out Hamas, the question is, will the other Palestinian parties, meaning the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the Fatah or the Hezbollah, will they see this as an attack on the Palestinian people? And will Israel then be fighting a multi-front war, not just a war with Gaza? That's the end game of Hamas, to incite a reaction that will stir up the entire Muslim world together against Israel, which they believe will then destroy Israel. But add one more thing, the spiritual component to this. Some say that this war is Hamas's way of waiting for the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. The Mahdi is their Messiah that they believe one day will come only after Israel is annihilated. They think the reason the Mahdi hasn't come is because Israel exists. But if they attack Israel, their Messiah will appear to protect them from retribution. So that's what Hamas has done. They've solidified their positions in Gaza by attacking Israel, hoping then that the Muslim world will participate in helping annihilate Israel. And if they can annihilate Israel, then their Messiah will come. Which brings us to why this land is so important and why both of these groups want it. And there's two perspectives here that we should think through. Now, you're talking about a people that have been fighting this war pretty much from day one. As God said about them that they would be a people, the Muslim people would be a people that would be a pain or a burden to their own brothers. And they were born into an environment that was already in conflict with the covenant and the promise that was on the Jewish people and on the father, Abraham, of the Jewish people. So this mindset that we think about here is nothing that you and I as Americans could even understand. Because we're talking about a mindset that has been passed down, hate that has been passed down for thousands of years. So in their mind, what happens between now and next week isn't a big deal. They're thinking about 20 years from now. They're thinking about 100 years from now. And they're planning it in that way. So from a military perspective, the land of Israel is very important because it's what they refer to as a land bridge. Now here you have Egypt to the south, which was a superpower of ancient times. But then to the north, you also have various potential superpowers, which could be Assyria, it could be Babylon, the Persians, the Greeks, or the Romans. Being that you never want to fight on your own land, the invading armies would march out against each other. And in this case, Israel sits right in the middle of these superpowers that could one day be fighting one another. They're the land bridge with the Mediterranean on one side and the mountain and the deserts on the other side. It's this one little piece that's the size of New Jersey, which is where they will always meet. Now, when we went on our trip to Israel, we visited Megiddo, Megiddo. And you, maybe as a believer knowing your Bible, would know Megiddo because of the Battle of Armageddon that one day will take place there. Now, the city of Megiddo was torn down and rebuilt 27 times. We saw it. They have unearthed 27 different levels of civilization. They continue to find things over and over again because of thousands of years. But they know that in that region, 27 different levels of civilization were established there. Why? Because that area, which is a mountain, and as you look out through the mountain over the valley where the Battle of Armageddon will take place, when you look at that, you can also see in the distance Syria. When we were there, you could hear, you could hear what were jets, fighter jets. You couldn't see them, they were so high. But you can hear the fighter jets off in the distance. And those mountain ranges are actually Syria. So while we're there, we're being shown this particular civilization over the years that had been established. And each one of them that was established, when a new reigning party or new military would come in, a new country would come in, that particular civilization would be destroyed and they would build their own. So they have 27 of them, which shows us geographically why everyone wanted the land of Israel, because that land of Israel was a land bridge that you would have to pass through. And if you were established or situated on that Megiddo, you would be able to see any approaching armies. So therefore, you wanted to conquer that. So this was important to this people group. Now, from a theological point of view, this thing goes even deeper, because now you put the spiritual aspects to it. And now the Jews believe, as well as I do, that the Bible teaches this was God-intended land for the Jewish people. And through that land is where or whom the Messiah would come. We know the Messiah came through that land because of Mary, his mother, who was in Israel, who would have had this encounter. We saw the birthplace of the Messiah. The Jews are still waiting for their Messiah. Now, the Arabs believe that God intended this land to be part of the Palestinian peoples and command to claim what is the Temple Mount, which is the third holiest site in Islam. Let me show you this. This is what you pretty much recall anytime you see a picture of Jerusalem or the Middle East. That dome is not ruled or owned by the Jewish people. The Muslims own that dome. And the reason they do so, it's the third holiest site in Islam. The first holiest site is Mecca, or what they call the cradle of Islam. It's the birthplace of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. The second is Medina, the mosque of the prophet Muhammad, where he was buried. This Temple Mount right here is where Muhammad ascended to heaven and returned one night, and thus the dome of the rock, they declare, is rightfully theirs. And they have ownership of that today. So to the Muslim people, it's an important site because of that Temple Mount. Now, to the Jews, they believe it to be the promised land that God had intended for them, that he actually spoke about to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And the Temple Mount there, underneath it on the mountain, is where Abraham would have gone to sacrifice Isaac on that mountain. It's a very holy place for them. It's right outside or right inside of what is the Western Wall. You would know the Western Wall. At one time, it was called the Wailing Wall. Now it's the Western Wall. The Western Wall is where you go and you pray. If you ever visit, you will most likely bring little pieces of paper with prayer requests or family member's name on it. You'll fold it up and you'll put it in between the rocks. That right there is the closest that most people will get to the site of where they say Abraham would have sacrificed Isaac, and there that covenant was made between him and God. as we would take a journey down inside that area. A few of us took that journey and that tour. And when you would get a portion of the way through, there would be very religious women. And there they would be praying, because that was considered to be the closest point in proximity to where that sacrifice would have made. So it comes down to both the Israelis, the Jews, and the Muslims wanting to take ownership of that dome of the rock. For the Jews, they believe it's where the Holy of Holies of the temple stood under Solomon and Herod's temple. Right there, God would have come down to meet man in the Holy of Holies, where the dome of the rock is now. To the Muslims, they believe this is where Muhammad made his ascent to heaven. And so both sides want the same land and even the same rock. Kind of reminds me of the story of my dad and the rock up at my farm, but we won't get into that. But now let's bring this down to where we're at today. Because what does the Bible say about all of this? Well, the Bible clearly teaches that God intended the land to belong to the Jewish people. And that was God's intention through Abraham and Moses, to the conquest under Joshua. And from that point all the way through Scripture, this is the homeland of the Jewish people. For the church world, though, there's also a controversy as it pertains to this and how it's playing out in what we call the end times, or eschatology, which is the science or the study of end times. The dispensationalists that are believers, that are Christians, they believe that the creation of 1948, the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948, was the fulfillment of prophecy, and that every promise made to the little nation of Israel must be fulfilled by a literal nation of Israel. Thus, they're reading what's happening right now as possibly an end-time scenario whereby the nations are going to attack Israel. And this brings about the rapture and then the 7-year tribulation and the 1,000-year millennial that then reigns and everything that then comes after that. That's a very popular theology, and it's a theology that, quite frankly, my Assembly of God roots had me believing throughout my life. And so anytime we had ever begin to talk about the end times, we always looked for chaos, because there would be wars and then rumors of wars. And either way, we were told to look up, because our help will come from the Lord. So I was raised with that theology. How many of you were raised with that same thing? How many of you, maybe you believe that? That's what we were raised in. Some of you have your teaching about Armageddon from watching TV, with all the movies of Armageddon and the end time events and how bad things are going to be. It started with us with Mad Max. Remember back in the day with Mad Max? Everything was destroyed. That's how I thought the world would look after the return of Christ and the Battle of Armageddon. Mad Max. Couldn't find water. Your batteries, you couldn't find enough sun, because you couldn't get your batteries charged because the sun was darkened by all the darkness that was covering the earth. I remember that when I was young, graduating high school, I was getting ready to go to school, and my dad had this preacher who was on staff with my dad. At the time, he was divorced and single, and he was teaching about the end times. Later, he met a woman in the church and he married her. Wonderful guy. But he was teaching about the end times, and he believed what I was just sharing with you about the end times. And one of the ladies in the church, after about 6 weeks of hearing this teaching, you know, back in the day, we'd go to church on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for Sunday school. Go out of Sunday school, then you'd go to church at 11. Then you'd get out of church at about 12:30, 1 o'clock, go home, have lunch, and go back to church at night. And then you had like Monday night prayer night, and then you'd take off a night. Then you'd have Wednesday night service, and then you had Thursday night choir practice, worship. And then maybe you got to stay home 3 nights out of the week, right? But we wanted our families to prosper and love one another, but we kept them in church all the time. So how could they go home and work on their family relationships? It's crazy what we did back in the day. But he was teaching on Sunday nights. The church is filled. It's packed. Because people were hearing this. It piques our interest. I think at the time Carter was president and we had crazy gas shortages in our country. And there were long lines waiting. I remember going to school at Coral Park High and having to sit in traffic and wait for like hours to get gas coming down Coral Way at 87th Avenue. And in the midst of all that was occurring in the Middle East again, we're hearing this teaching on the end times. And one of the ladies, young girl in the church actually, came up to me and said, Steve, why are you going to college? Don't you know Jesus is returning soon? I'm so thankful I didn't listen to that stuff. I would have never gone to college. I would have never had a crazy reputation with the certain sex. And Mary's older sister would have never noticed me, which then when I met Mary, she told Mary all those years later, why are you dating him? He was such a player. We would have never had good stories to tell if I didn't go to college. And though it took me 5 years to finish a 4-year school, I proved that I was real diligent. Here's the point. This philosophy or theology today, it looks at Gog and Magog in the Bible and the passages of Ezekiel and Zechariah. And as we read it, we would say that the Bible foresaw this conflict. But I think there are other events like the Holocaust and like what was happening in the war with Hitler and what happened in Vietnam and every other war that we as a country would have experienced. If we looked at all of those things then in the moment, we may have bought into this philosophy that, okay, this is the beginning of the end. So personally, I'm not fully convinced that this dispensationalist, where it means God has different seasons and dispensations that occurred, and therefore get ready because we're in the final dispensation. I'm just not sure that is all there is to the revelation of the end times. There's also something called replacement theology, and there's got like 7 different ones, 6 or 7 different theologies about the end time. One of them is called replacement theology, which means that when Christ came, every promise that was given to the Jewish people, that because then they participated in the death and didn't receive Jesus as their Messiah, they then became replaced by the Christian. And so this replacement theology says all the promises given to Israel is now solely given, taken off them, and now given to the Christian people. I'm not sure that's the truth and what we see taking place in these end times. And though every Jew that we know of is not godly, there are some Jews that are. Just like there's some Palestinians, they're not all evil. There are some Palestinians that are godly. Here's what I believe and what I will close with today. I think the Jews are a special people to God. And He's using them still as His chosen people. Just go there one day and you sense what I'm talking about. It's just a very special environment that you know God is in. I know that God loves the Jews, the Palestinians, and the Gentiles. It's in Galatians 3, verse 28 that says, in Christ there is neither Jew, nor Greek, nor bond, nor free. But the key there is in Christ. I believe God cares deeply about what's happening in that region. I believe He's grieved by the hatred and the evil demonic spirit that's caused this war to begin with, especially on October the 7th. But I also believe that God is still using the Jewish people in a unique way. And though I personally can't explain all of that, and I don't know how all of that works in the end time scenarios necessarily, I don't believe that God has replaced the Jews with the Christians. But what I see in the Bible is that God teaches. He shows us that he had an intention for Abraham and his descendants. And he gave them a land. He promised them a land, which is their promised land. And what I have found over the years of my life is that any and every promise God ever gives us will always come with demonic opposition. The enemy does not want us operating or receiving or having any promise that God wants to give us. So if it was a promise from God to have dirt and a rock and a land with territories for his people, which he outlined specifically for them, if that was his promise, then you better believe evil will try to keep them from it. So what are we thinking about? What are we doing when we walk out of here today? Get up and go to work tomorrow? Here's what we do. We understand this. You ready? It may not be the end, but we are one day closer to eternity than we have ever been. And we only have today to be ready. And if we're learning anything, we have to know somehow or other God is still in charge. And if he's in charge, none of this surprises him. He's still on the throne. He's still the King of Kings and he's still the Lord of Lords. And our most important job is to not speculate about the future, but to have faith in God and be ready in the present. So as a pastor, I want to side with King David. Because for David, as king of Israel, he felt something significant about the land, similar to what all of us feel when we travel there. So much so that one day in his leadership word that he would have posted on social media, he gets up and he makes this declaration about praying for the peace of Jerusalem, because he saw the value of that dirt and that rock. How am I praying? 5 things. 1, I'm praying for the peace of Israel in the region, because Psalm 122 verse 6 tells us to do so. I'm asking God to expose the evil that is transpiring. The Bible says, I'll bless those who bless you, but I'm going to curse those who curse you. Who are the ones that are causing this curse? Reveal it to us, God. I'm also seeking to support Israel in prayer and financial support, because if he says, I'll bless those who bless you, I want our Metro Life Church blessed. And I believe one of the reasons we are all these years is because we've always blessed and we've always sown towards Israel. And we're doing that today. And when this conflict originated, this war began, financially, we stepped right into it, and Pastor Mary will share that with you. I'm also asking God to reveal himself to the Muslim people. The word tells us salvation comes from the Lord. Who will he expose himself, reveal himself to now in the Muslim world? From the higher ups to the very lowest of lows, our prayer is, God, let Jesus become real to these very dedicated people. And then I'm having faith that God is working this out for the good of the gospel. The word tells us that this gospel will be preached throughout all the land. Here's our chance. Don't take sides against Israel, church. Pray for them. Bless them. Pray for every person that is innocent, that is in the midst of this war. And as you do so, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Amen. Bless you. Trust you, encourage. Bye-bye.
Hey there, if you enjoyed this video from Metro Life, then we have more content for you to enjoy. We've got music, podcasts, sermons, and messages from our team. We believe that relationship matters. And getting to know one another is a key part of those relationships. So get to know us by looking around this channel. Like, comment, and subscribe. And we look forward to meeting you soon.